going to be an introduction, some case studies, some like pedagogical case studies to get you thinking a little bit about why would I use steady flow? Is it just because I went to the steady flow class and it's the only thing I know? Or are there like legitimate reasons why you would choose steady flow even if you knew the whole suite of software? And then I'm going to just kind of take you through the basic workflow. I remember when I got hired with the Corps, I was at the University of Wisconsin, and I thought, uh-oh, I better learn RAS. And I loaded it, and I just thought, okay, what are all of these files? And so we're just going to try to walk you through, we're going to try to be like the RAS file whisperer this morning and just kind of let you know, what is the Q file? What is the R file? All right, so here we go. Okay, so the three things we're going to talk about right off the bat. What is steady flow? When would I use steady flow? And what are the components of a steady flow model? All right, there are two kinds of flow, steady and unsteady. And the main difference is time. All right, steady flow assumes that flow is constant with time. In fact, there is no temporal component in steady flow. And so if you were to plot it with time, it's just flat. It's not that interesting. Unsteady flow is a hydrograph. Unsteady flow comes from hydrology. There is a temporal component. Flow increases and decreases with time. And so the basic idea is that flow does not change in steady flow. And flow does change in unsteady flow. Well, that's not exactly true. Because flow can actually change gradually with steady flow. You can take a series of snapshots that remove time from the equation and do a kind of quasi-unsteady flow with a series of steady flows. But the basic idea is that each steady flow has no temporal component in it. And so in the RAS toolbar, hopefully most of you have at least seen the RAS toolbar, steady flow comes from these two buttons. You have the steady flow component, and then the RAS running person who is on a flat surface, just running out the steady flow. Unsteady flow has flow that's a function of time. We have our hydrograph, and then we have our RAS running person kind of climbing the hydrograph. And the basic idea is that steady and unsteady flow have this, the difference is this temporal component. And the thing that I like to point out is that you basically make steady, unsteady decisions every day, right? You have a little steady, unsteady flow modeler in your pocket. We just talked about it. If I'm going to take a picture, I get asked, do I want to take a picture or a video? And I make this decision, do I want a steady or unsteady model of reality? And sometimes, the video is more expensive. The picture is easier to send. It is a cost precision decision that you're making. And so this is exactly what you're doing. Do I want a snapshot of the hydraulic situation, or do I want a video? Do I want the temporal component? One is going to be more expensive, but it's going to have a more robust picture of temporal reality. And that's the decision you're making between steady and unsteady flow. And so the question is, why should I use steady flow? When would you use steady flow? Well, the real question is, why would I use unsteady? Why would I use steady flow? Like Nick just went to the 2D class, right? He's ready to go with 2D unsteady flow, right? RAS does unsteady flow. It does 2D unsteady flow. It does sediment transport. It does water quality. It does rain on grid. Why would I do a steady flow model? And the answer starts with a P. Anyone know it?
Price.
Price is good. Price is good. Precision is why I wouldn't choose it. Parsimony. The answer is parsimony. The principle of parsimony is that you want to use the simplest tool that will work. And the best articulation of the principle of parsimony comes from Einstein Sr., or at least is attributed to Einstein Sr. I have to say Einstein Sr. because his son, Hans Albert Einstein, is one of the great sediment transport experts in the world. And so he's the one that I know better. But Einstein Sr. is purported to have said that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. That's the principle of parsimony. If you search Einstein's writings or transcripts, it doesn't seem like he ever actually said that. What he actually said was, it can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single domain datum experience. I appreciate the person who summed that up. But the idea is that your job is to create a numerical model of reality to answer the questions of the project managers. That's what you get paid to. You get paid to reduce the risk of the project managers. That means that the simplest tool is the null hypothesis. You have to have a reason to move off of the simplest tool. The simplest tool should be your first assumption. And the simplest tool is steady flow hydraulics. And so if the simplest tool, steady flow hydraulics, is the null hypothesis, if that's your opening offer, when wouldn't you use steady flow hydraulics is really the main question. And there are two main reasons you wouldn't use it. There are two questions I ask myself. Does volume matter? And does time matter? Does volume matter? And does time matter? Because those are the two main things that you lose in a steady flow analysis. And so let's take, for example, volume. Most of you know that as a flood wave moves downstream, it attenuates. The volume doesn't, if there's no tributaries, the volume doesn't change, but the peak will drop. And why is that? Attenuation. Infiltration is a great answer, but let's assume there's no infiltration. As the flood wave moves downstream, some of the water ends up stored. Some of the volume ends up stored in the floodplains. And so it gets kind of pulled out and then pushed back in later. And so you have volume storage as you move down the floodplain, which means volume matters. So in steady flow, we don't account for that volume. It's a snapshot in time. That's a temporal volume abstraction process. So in steady flow, you would have to get your hydrograph from everyone's second favorite H&H program, HEC-RAS, and get your hydrograph up here, and then have your hydrograph down here, and know how much the flow dropped due to attenuation, and then you're going to put in the peak flow here, and then take out little slivers of flow as it moves downstream to get this like dropping flow, a snapshot of dropping flow. You can do it. It's a little kludgy. Whereas in unsteady flow, you take your HMS hydrograph, you put it in there, unsteady flow solves the shallow water flow equations and automatically figures out how much water is stored and drops your peak as it moves downstream. It's kind of a more elegant result, but there's a cost to pay. Okay, the second is timing. Okay, volume or timing? Here's a first quiz question. The peak flow in this main stem is 500 CFS. The peak flow in this tributary is 200 CFS. What is the peak flow at the confluence? At least 500. That's a very precise answer. Does anyone want to give me a more precise answer? Is it 700? It's somewhere between 500 and 700. 700 seems intuitive if the peaks are coincident. But what we often find is that those peaks actually are often not coincident, which means at least 500 is the precise answer, because these could be offset. So that you could have your 500 CFS peak here that's actually coincident with 20 CFS here, and so your peak flow here is about 520. So it could be anywhere between 500 and 700. In unsteady flow, we'll work all that out for you. In steady flow, you're going to have to figure that out in HMS. And HMS will work that out for you. But then we actually make you go in and put a flow in here because we don't assume that those peaks are coincident. We make you do that work. And so you do have to do some of this work externally. But if you have a hydrologic model, that's all right. In steady flow, RAS isn't going to work the timing out for you. OK, and then the third reason that I would definitely kind of move away from a steady flow model is any sort of like storage or time storage to kind of take the peak off a hydrograph. And so one of the things that we'll sometimes use is either an inline or an offline storage area or reservoir in order to take the peak off a hydrograph. So in this case, we have, flow comes downstream, and we have a lateral structure and a storage area here. And the idea is once water gets to a certain elevation, it's going to go and get stored in this facility in order to take the peak off the hydrograph. Well, that's fundamentally temporal. You can't do that with a steady flow model. In fact, in general, there are some cases where we allow lateral structures and storage areas in steady flow, but we don't teach them in the steady flow class because I would say about 90% of the time they're inappropriate because generally you're looking at a timing question when you're trying to take water off laterally. And then if you add a pump, well, pumps are just time series. And so anytime you want to pump to take water from one place and put it in another place, that's fundamentally temporal. So there are some features in RAS. They're just kind of fundamentally temporal. The only way you can use them is unsteady flow. But if you have a one-dimensional problem and you're looking at either a snapshot of peak flows or maybe a snapshot of low flows for an environmental study, steady flow still does a great job. There's a lot of times when I will choose steady flow. And the reason is, well, there are three reasons. There are three main reasons to choose steady flow, one-dimensional, over the other modes in RAS. And those are big, quick, and perks, all right? Big, quick, and then there are just some perks that are only available with the 1D steady flow. Let's start with big. The runtimes are still the main reason to choose 1D over 2D. 2D generally has 1, 2, or 3 orders of magnitude more computational nodes, and so that's kind of linear with runtime. But 1D steady flow, I've never had a 1D steady flow project that took more than 10 seconds. Right? I have 1D unsteady flow projects that take 4 hours. So if you need short runtimes, or if you have really big models, they can be really hard to troubleshoot. And so steady flow is excellent for really big models. And so this is the Mekong in Southeast Asia. The Mekong is the 7th largest river in the world. It's the 2nd most biodiverse. They're looking at a lot of things on this river, but they brought us in and asked us to teach them how to do a 2D model of this river. And this is about 20% of the Mekong River, and it's 500 miles. And so eventually they want to do a full scope Mekong model, and we're talking about 1,000, 2,000 models. 2,000 miles, and that's not unlike the Missouri or parts of the Mississippi, or even the Columbia or the Rio Grande. We have large rivers in this country. It's a big country, and so the question was, well, should we do a 2D model of this? No, that's going to take forever. Well, how about an unsteady model? Well, if you look at the Mekong, this is what a lot of the channel looks like, right? This is fundamentally one-dimensional. And so if you think about, why do we use one-dimensional models with rivers? For decades, we've used one-dimensional models for rivers. And that's because rivers have a very high aspect ratio. They're much longer than they are wide. This is why one-dimensional models have been excellent for many, many years. And it's still the question you want to ask is does the lateral dimension matter? Just looking at these pictures, does the lateral dimension matter that much? No, this is kind of a fundamentally one-dimensional system, and the hydrograph rises slowly and falls slowly, which means that by the time the flow gets from the upper end to the lower end, the flow hasn't changed or abstracted that much. And so we can do steady flow hydraulics, 1D steady flow hydraulics. We can run this 500 miles in less than 10 seconds, and these are the calibrations for multiple flows. One, you want to use the simplest model that does the job, and 1D steady flow does this job. Okay, second, you want to use it for big models because of runtimes, and you want to use it for quick analyses, expedited analyses. I know that, well, you may not have experienced this yet, but this is life in a federal agency, is that someone will come to you and say, I need an answer, and you say, okay, this is the scope, and they say, that's great, I'll give you 10% of that. And that's just life in a federal agency. We are problem solvers. We're not scientists. I'm kind of an applied scientist, but really that's who we are. We have to answer questions for the budget that's provided, and so we want to reduce the risk of the project managers and the taxpayers. We want to provide the biggest increment of risk reduction for the lowest cost. And so a lot of times you'll be asked to do expedited analysis, particularly for restoration studies. Restoration studies do not come with very much money. And so I find that a lot of times I will choose steady flow because it's quick. Now, does it take a lot more time to set up an unsteady flow model than a steady flow model? It does not. I can set up unsteady flow model in probably twice the time. Probably takes me twice the time to set up an unsteady flow model, maybe not even that. Where does the time really go? Well, the secret about unsteady flow modeling that we don't tell you until you come to the unsteady flow modeling class is that it's hard. The St. Venant equations are persnickety. If I'm scoping a 1D unsteady flow model, like 60% of my budget is getting that thing stable. And so if I need an answer in 60 days, and I can scope a steady flow model, I am. Because I know I'll get a strong answer if timing or volume are not a big deal. And so here's an example. This is the Espanola Valley restoration on the Rio Grande. This was provided by Jonathan Abercon from the Albuquerque district. And the Espanola Valley, just a catastrophe. This thing was straightened. There's lots of gravel mining through here. The channel has incised like 9 feet. And it's completely disconnected from the floodplain. This is one of the things about channel incision, is that when the channel incises, you're just going to get a little sediment transport. It's just going to happen. It just comes out. But when the channel incises, you lose connection with the floodplain. Floodplain communities, they're there because they're used to getting inundated every 2 years. That's not bad for them. It's necessary. For cottonwoods to recruit, there needs to be floodplain inundation every 2 years. And when you incise the channel, you lose that, and you lose your riparian community. And so, this kind of over the last 40 years, we've come to understand this. And so the Espanola restoration, it's this huge multi-agency and particularly tribal initiative to kind of undo this and restore ecosystem connectivity while not increasing flood risk, right? Those are the things you need to do. Now this just got funded, and it got funded for big money, but back then, when it was just a dream, it did not have a lot of funding. And this is the Rio Grande, so a lot of it's flat, but there are some steep reaches, and it's the steep reaches, so when unsteady flow will particularly go unstable at peak flows or at base flows, because anything that's a riffle pool system will go through critical depth, and the unsteady flow model has a lot of trouble with that. And also particularly steep reaches. And so Jonathan's team, they built a steady flow model of this system. It's a dendritic system. There isn't a lot of overbank storage. It's pretty short, so you don't have volume or timing issues. And they were able to come up with a steady state model to evaluate the peaks and the base flows, both for the urban areas, but also for the potential floodplain restoration sites. And it's a pretty long, pretty stable model. And one of the nice things about 1D is because of the magic of Mapper, Cam and Alex and Anton, even though you've got a 1D result, you get a nice 2D map. It was enough to make the decisions that had to be made. And like I said, this actually just got funded for big money based on this analysis. Okay, and then the third reason to use steady flow is for the perks, for the benefits. There are some features, some really cool features in RAS that are only available for steady flow. And why is that? Well, they got funded 15 years ago when steady flow was the main thing, and they haven't been added to the other things since then, but they're still really, really cool. 3 examples are scour, floodways for now, and ice. First, scour. A surprising amount of loss of life and destruction of property for high flows comes from bridge scour. Essentially, large flows scour the foundation of bridges, undermine the piles, and then you get but that's all invisible to the people driving over the bridge. And so this is a catastrophic failure. How deep do we have to put these pilings to account for scour processes. And so this is Federal Highway HEC-18, which is weird because when I heard HEC-18, I thought the HEC suite only goes up to 6. Like, no, this is not our tool. This is hydrologic circular from the Federal Highway, but we put it in RAS. And so you can do bridge scour analysis in RAS, but only in steady flow. Now, we're not going to talk anymore about scour or sediment. I will tell you that rivers carry sediment. Most rivers are brown. If you are interested in sediment, we just released a podcast. So we are interviewing a lot of the river engineering and sediment transport experts in the Corps of Engineers. If you're interested in that, check out the podcast. The second thing that you can only do with steady flow for now is encroachment analysis. The idea is that, if you build in the floodplain, you raise the water surface elevation for people upstream, and so that is a taking, essentially. And so you have to do an encroachment analysis to figure out, where not only is the floodplain, but where can't you build in order to not have a taking upstream. And so for now, this is only in 1D. I'm sorry, this is only in 1D steady flow. In some soon future version, this will be in 1D unsteady and 2D. But for now, it's still one of the things you can only do in steady flow. And then third, where are my ice districts? Ice districts, there's a few of them. All right, you can only do ice jams in steady flow. And ice jams are really important. Omaha has some big ice jams, Buffalo for sure. Let me tell you a story. This is the Muskegon River. This is Detroit district. And the Muskegon River, if you look at the 1% stage, if you look at what FEMA says is the 1% stage, they've hit that 10 times in the last 20 years, not a 1% stage. But that's because they just did a standard hydrologic analysis, FFA, and then they stuck it in RAS, and they didn't realize that most of the flooding comes from ice jams. And so you have to do an ice jam analysis in a lot of these facilities. I hired an intern who lived in Big Rapids, and her summer job for 2 years was I did a hydrometeorological model to identify the 1,500 most likely dates for an ice jam, and then she went to the microfiche and looked at the newspapers from those days, those 1,500 days to see if there was an ice jam, and we found 17 of them out of an 80-year period of record. That's a significant failure mode. She also learned a lot about World War II, apparently. And so the Detroit district flew LiDAR. And so we had brand new, beautiful LiDAR, and we got these really nice cross sections. Anyone feel uncomfortable with that cross section? You would be shocked at how often we see models like this, where you just have the LiDAR, and then you have, what is this? What's going on here? LiDAR doesn't penetrate water. Well, some of it does, but rarely gets used, right? And so, of course, we also had to deploy a team to survey cross sections. And RAS has really slick tools to combine these data. And so then we had our series of cross sections, and we had some high water marks. This is one of the kind of basic rules of federal work, is that if you have an event, go gather the data. Go get the calibration data. I often tell people I would trade half the budget of any modeling study for calibration data, because you can't reproduce reality without calibration data. I'm going to give you a better result with half the budget and calibration data than I would with twice the budget. And so if you have an event, chances are you're going to get asked to reproduce that event at some point. Go measure it. And so the community of Big Rapids did. They went right out after this event. They got the high water lines. They got the ice lines. And so we had some survey data through here. And then we went through and we surveyed in all the tree scars. Because when an ice jam comes through, it tears up the trees. We actually have a paper about this. We did dendrochronology too, but that's outside of the scope of this talk. And so then you can run not only an ice cover model, but an ice jam model in RAS. And ice jams tend to form where you have changes in slope, so here and here. And you can see that these are the high water marks, and then these are the tree scars. And so we actually reproduced the event with, this is just steady flow, stable and quick. All right, So finally, what are the components of a steady flow model? One of the things that you'll notice about RAS is that it's a pretty modular program. You have lots of windows open. Kim will sometimes come into my office and see that I have like 800 windows open, and it's like, how do you work this way? Well, it's just kind of okay, don't work that way, but it is also just kind of how RAS works, is it's fundamentally modular. And I remember when I first started using RAS, until Eric joined the team, I was the only one that, I was the only member of the RAS team that was a RAS user before I was a developer. And so I have this experience of using RAS just kind of at the University of Wisconsin and then at the Buffalo District. And I remember thinking, what are all these windows? What are all these files? I am so confused. And then about a month later, I thought, oh, this was the only way you could do this with this much power. But if you're in that I'm so confused phase, that's all right. We're just going to try to get you past that. This is the basic conceptual model of a RAS program. To run RAS, you need 4 files. You need a project file. You need 1 project file. That is just a bucket. All the other files go in that bucket. You'll notice that the project file is like 13 kilobytes or something like that. Like it's just a bucket that's pointing to all the other files. You'll never think about that again, except that whatever name you give it, all the other ones will inherit, so you might regret that. So think about that early on. Then you need 2 data files. We're going to skip the middle one. You need 2 data files. You need a geometry file, and you need a flow file, in this case, a steady flow file. Those need to be paired. The primary purpose of the plan file is just to pair them, and that's it. But you can have lots of these. The reason that RAS is modular is because, and so that's why the main window of RAS is just a toolbar with paths, right? It's not very pretty. Zach is making a new opening interface for RAS 7.0 that's much prettier. But for now, this is really useful, because what does it tell you? It tells you the 4 files that are active: the project file, the plan file, the geometry file, and the flow file. Project, P, G, and F. Now, are there other files? Yeah, there's a C file, an R file, all sorts of files. You don't care. That's trash we're creating, and we won't create that in 7.0. But that's the basic paradigm. Now, why do we do it that way? Why isn't it all in one? Well, because this makes it modular. So now you can mix and match. And so imagine that instead of 1 flow file and 1 geometry file, you actually have 3 different, you have your as-built conditions, but then you have 2 different alignments of your levee, or 2 different bridge designs. So now, but you still only have the same flow. Flow's not changing. So now you can have 3 plans, and they all point to the same flow, but the 3 different geometries. Or vice versa, if you have 1 geometry but 3 flows, let's say that you're going to reoperate your reservoir. So nothing's going to change downstream, but the peak flows are going to change for your different alternatives. Again, you have 3 plans that match the same geometry with the different flows. And this is an end problem, right? This starts to get big, because then you have like 4 flows, or you have your 7 FDA flows, and then you have your 3 alternatives. The only way you could pull that off is by mixing and matching and having this modular design. But there's a little bit of a cost of learning to negotiate that most of that cost you'll pay this week. Okay, so what are the basic components? First, your geometry file. You will do most of your work in your geometry file. And at this point, you're actually going to do most of your work in Mapper. You know, Chris Dunn said this class is 30 years old, but this isn't the 30-year-old version of it. The truth is that we actually kind of just redid this class. The stuff you're going to get from Cam later this week, you're not the first ones to do it, but like it's only been in the last 5 years that Mapper has become the central tool that you do all this in. And so that's really cool. You're going to learn all that. But Mapper fundamentally makes a geometry file. And a geometry file really is a collection of cross-sections and structures. And so you're going to create a number of cross-sections and then your structures in your geometry file. The main component of a one-dimensional model is the cross-section. The quality of your cross-sections will determine the quality of your model. Cross-sections have station elevation data. They have roughness. We're going to have a whole talk about choosing your n value tomorrow. But then varsity modelers really put a lot of time into these 4 components: your channel banks, your ineffective flow areas, your levees. I put that in quotes because that's not the same thing as a lateral structure, and then your blocked obstructions. The channel banks are their own thing. The other 3, the ineffective flow areas, the levees, and the blocked obstructions, are they're slightly different ways of doing the same thing, and that is taking flow out of the cross section. Now, Cam's going to talk about each one of those, but the varsity modeling is giving some thought to doing these right. And so during the bridge day, we're going to hit ineffective flows until you are just so tired of it. And I'm just going to say, I don't care, because the number one thing I see when I review models is just ineffective flow area disasters. The main way that you get quasi-two-dimensionality out of your one-dimensional model is by getting your ineffective flow areas right. And we'll talk a lot about that this week. Okay, so then you have your cross sections, you have your geometry. Now you're going to build your flow file. And in your flow, you're just going to define, you have to define your upstream flows. And then, like we said, if any place the flow changes, either with a tributary or a drop in water surface, you're going to have to define a flow. And then you can have multiple profiles. We'll have a whole talk on this, but we're just kind of we're trying to give you the lay of the land. And then the plan file just takes the geometry file and a steady flow file, some documentation, and then you make a regime decision. And that's mainly what you do in the plan file. It's just a pointer to 2 other files. You run, and you have your model.